The wind howled through the trees, a shrill, piercing sound that echoed through the desolate landscape. Snow blanketed the world in a thick, suffocating silence. The once familiar woods now looked alien, their bare branches stretching like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. The air bit at the skin, sharp and unforgiving, as though nature itself resented the intrusion of any living thing. It was a winter's day, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever, where the sun barely fought through the clouds, and the chill of the season clung to the bones. Daniel had come to the woods to escape the noise of the world, to find some semblance of peace in the vast emptiness of nature. He was tired of the hustle and bustle of city life, tired of the constant buzz of social media and the demands of his job. The isolation of this place, with its deep, endless silence, should have been comforting, but something about it was unsettling. The snow crunched under his boots with each step, a sound that was somehow too loud in the stillness. As he walked further into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted limbs casting eerie shadows on the snow-covered ground. The deeper he went, the darker it became. He thought he heard something in the distance, a low, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper carried by the wind. But when he stopped to listen, all he heard was the relentless howling of the wind. Yet something in the pit of his stomach told him he wasn't alone. As Daniel trudged through the snow, the eerie quiet of the forest grew more oppressive. The wind had calmed, but the silence was even worse now, hanging in the air like a thick fog. His breath came out in quick, visible puffs, but it wasn't just the cold that made him shiver. Something didn't feel right. The woods seemed unnervingly still, as if the very earth held its breath. He paused, straining his ears, but there was no sound, nothing but the cold crunch of his boots against the snow. Yet, as he continued walking, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like a branch bending under weight. But the trees around him were still. The sound wasn't from nature. It was something else. His heart began to race. He quickened his pace, dismissing it as nothing more than his imagination. But then, there it was again. This time, closer. The creaking wasn't the only noise. A low, faint whisper seemed to ride the wind, its words indistinguishable but unmistakably human. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks, his pulse thundering in his ears. His eyes darted around the woods, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life. Just the same, endless stretch of snow-covered trees. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was the wind, the cold playing tricks on him. But as he stood there, every hair on his neck stood on end. The longer he waited, the more the sensation of being watched grew. The feeling of eyes on him, unseen but ever present. His breath caught in his throat as a sudden gust of wind blew, cutting through the trees, and he couldn't shake the thought. I'm not alone here. The deeper he ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in, as if the very trees were pressing in on him. His mind began to play tricks. Every shadow, every rustle in the distance seemed like something waiting for him to make a mistake. Was he imagining it, or was something real out there, following him? The cold wasn't just in his body anymore. It was crawling under his skin, seeping into his thoughts. The wind howled again, but this time it wasn't just the wind. It was a sound deeper, more guttural, almost like the ground itself was groaning in pain. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the whispering grew louder, now clear. Come closer. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was a voice, cold and malevolent, wrapped in the chill of winter. He turned, desperately searching for the source, but the forest was a maze of snow and twisted trees. The cold had begun to feel like it was inside him, suffocating him, pressing against his chest. Then, through the trees, he saw it. A figure, barely visible at first, standing motionless. It was tall, its silhouette shadowed and thin, its face hidden beneath a dark, tattered hood. The air around it seemed to warp, the snow beneath its feet frozen solid, not a single flake stirring. As Daniel took a step back, the figure moved toward him with unnatural speed, gliding across the snow without a sound. Panic surged through him. His mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but there was none. The whisper grew louder, a cacophony of voices now, all urging him forward. His limbs felt heavy, his body frozen by an unseen force. The cold was no longer just physical. It was a presence, a weight, wrapping around him like a straitjacket. His sanity cracked, and in that moment, he realized there was no escape. The forest had claimed him. Daniel stumbled back toward the edge of the forest, his heart pounding, his breath shallow and frantic. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered in the frigid air, like a shadow that refused to leave. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened, but all he could grasp was a deep, gnawing terror. He had seen it, felt it. The cold, the whispers, the creature. Everything was real. The forest was not just a place. It was alive, malevolent. As he reached the edge of the woods, a chilling thought seized him. It's not over. The whispers were still there, just beyond the wind. As Daniel emerged from the woods, gasping for air, he thought he was free. But the air felt wrong, thick with an unnatural stillness. He glanced behind him, half expecting to see the dark figure again. To his horror, the snow around him was untouched, except for one set of footprints, trailing behind him, fresh in the untouched snow. He froze, his blood running cold. The whispers were back, now in his ears, closer than ever. And he knew, with bone-chilling certainty, that whatever had followed him was still with him, waiting. The terror hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The small cabin stood alone at the edge of the frozen lake, its wooden walls frosted over from the relentless chill of winter. Snow blanketed the ground in an unbroken sheet of white, the kind that sparkled faintly under the pale light of the sun, which barely pierced through the heavy gray clouds above. The air was so cold it seemed to bite, stinging exposed skin and turning every breath into visible clouds of mist. Everything was eerily still. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the faint creak of ice shifting beneath the frozen surface of the lake. Clara, a 27-year-old artist, had come to this remote cabin to escape the noise of the city and the weight of her deadlines. She needed inspiration, and the solitude of this winter retreat seemed perfect. Days of painting in silence, surrounded by nature, had felt like a dream at first. But now, as she stood at the frosted window staring out at the endless snow, a strange unease crept over her. She told herself it was the isolation getting to her, but it felt like more than that. The light was fading quickly, the kind of sudden dusk that winter brings. The trees at the edge of the lake cast long shadows on the snow, their silhouettes jagged and unnatural. Clara squinted, certain she had seen something move between the trees, a flicker of darkness against the white. She shook her head, brushing it off. It's just the wind, or my imagination, she thought. But as the shadows deepened, the silence seemed to grow heavier, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't as alone as she thought. Clara sat by the fireplace, its warmth doing little to chase away the chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. The logs crackled softly, but outside, the wind had picked up, whistling mournfully around the cabin. She tried to focus on her sketch pad, but her pencil hovered above the paper, her mind too distracted to create. It wasn't just the cold making her uneasy. It was the silence between the gusts of wind, a silence so profound it felt unnatural. Then there was a noise. Faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of snow crunching underfoot. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She strained to listen, but the sound had stopped as abruptly as it began. Probably just an animal, she thought, trying to calm herself, but her fingers trembled as she gripped the pencil. Moments later, the noise came again, louder this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin, crunching closer to the window before fading away into the trees. Clara's heart raced as she peered through the frosted glass, but all she saw was darkness and the faint outline of snow-covered pines. Her rational mind screamed that it was just the wind shifting the snow, but deep down, she knew better. As the hours stretched on, the strange noises multiplied. Knocks on the walls, a faint tapping at the window, and once, a sound like whispering carried by the wind. Clara felt the walls of the cabin closing in, the cold pressing tighter around her like a predator stalking its prey. She wrapped herself in a blanket, her thoughts spiraling. Was it the isolation getting to her? Or was something, or someone, out there, waiting for her to let her guard down? The knocking returned, louder and more insistent, rattling the cabin walls as if something, or someone, was demanding to be let in. Clara bolted upright, clutching the blanket to her chest, her eyes darting toward the door. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one visible in the icy air. "It's just the wind," she repeated in her mind, but deep down, she knew better. Then, the whispering started again, this time unmistakable and far too close. The words were indecipherable, but their intent was clear, malicious and cruel. Clara backed away from the door, her legs trembling. Her gaze shot to the window, and her blood ran cold. There, pressed against the frosted glass, was the faint imprint of a hand, skeletal and clawed. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The fire sputtered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. Clara felt the presence before she saw it, a dark figure standing in the corner of the room, its shape barely distinguishable from the shadows. Its eyes, cold and piercing, glowed faintly, pinning her in place. Her mind screamed at her to move, but her body refused. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. Clara's fear overwhelmed her, the icy grip of terror suffocating her completely. This wasn't just isolation, and it wasn't her imagination. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. Her mind screamed at her to move, but her body refused. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally slow and deliberate. Clara's fear overwhelmed her, the icy grip of terror suffocating her completely. This wasn't just isolation, and it wasn't her imagination. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. Clara sat huddled in the corner of the cabin, her breath shallow, and her eyes darting to every shadow that moved with the flicker of the dying fire. The figure had vanished as suddenly as it appeared, leaving no trace behind. No prints in the snow, no lingering sounds, nothing. Yet the air felt heavy, oppressive, as though it was still watching her, waiting for the right moment. Her mind raced, replaying every sound, every whisper, every chilling moment. She wanted to believe it was her imagination, the isolation twisting her thoughts, but the clawed handprint on the window said otherwise. Even as dawn began to creep through the trees, Clara knew the night's terror hadn't truly ended. The cabin had seen her, and something in the forest had noticed her. It always would. As Clara stepped outside at first light, desperate to leave the cabin behind, the snow stretched before her, untouched, pristine. No footprints, no sign of the nightmare she had endured. Relief washed over her, if only for a moment. But then she glanced back at the cabin and froze. In the frost-covered window, The clawed handprint was still there, freshly imprinted, and from the shadowy corner of the room inside, two faintly glowing eyes stared back at her. The forest wasn't letting her go. Not yet. The snow fell in heavy, silent sheets, blanketing the forest in a thick layer of white. Every branch, every tree trunk, every uneven patch of ground was smoothed out, leaving a landscape so pristine it felt untouched by time. The only sound was the faint crunch of footsteps as Mia, a 32-year-old artist, trudged deeper into the woods. She'd come here seeking inspiration, away from the chaos of the city, craving the solitude and stillness that only winter could offer. Her rented cabin sat a mile behind her, its warmth and light swallowed by the dense trees. She had promised herself a quick walk before sunset, hoping to sketch the forest in its most serene state. But as she ventured further, something about the stillness began to gnaw at her. The air felt too quiet, as though the world was holding its breath. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Shadows stretched long and thin across the snow, shifting slightly as the light began to fade. Mia paused, clutching her sketchbook tightly against her chest. A strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck, as if the forest itself was watching her, waiting for her to notice. The biting wind whispered past her ears, carrying a sound that could have been the distant howl of an animal, or a voice calling her name. As Mia continued through the forest, the silence grew heavier, almost oppressive. The crunch of her boots on the snow seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in a way it shouldn't have. She stopped for a moment, trying to shake the strange sensation creeping over her. That's when she heard it, a faint creak, like the sound of a tree bending under the weight of snow, but closer, more deliberate. She turned, her breath fogging in the cold air, scanning the forest. Nothing moved. The trees stood as still as ever, but the shadows seemed deeper, darker. She laughed nervously, trying to convince herself it was nothing more than her imagination. But as she turned back to the path, the sound came again, closer this time, and not a creak, but a crunch, like a footstep. Her pulse quickened as she quickened her pace, the once beautiful forest now feeling suffocating. The wind whistled through the branches, and for a moment it sounded like a low, guttural whisper. Mia froze. Her grip on her sketchbook tightened as she forced herself to listen. "Just the wind," she muttered, her voice shaky. But the unease grew with every step. The trees seemed to close in around her, their shadows stretching unnaturally long as the sun dipped lower. She swore she could feel eyes on her, though every glance over her shoulder revealed nothing but snow and trees. Then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, she heard it. A voice, soft and distorted, whispering her name. "Mia." Mia's breath quickened as the whispers grew louder, echoing from all around her. They overlapped, soft and taunting, voices that didn't belong to anyone she could see. The sky darkened faster than it should have, the dim light casting the forest into an eerie twilight. She stumbled forward, clutching her sketchbook as though it could anchor her to reality. Then she saw it. Just ahead, in the clearing, a figure emerged from the shadows. A woman, or what seemed like one. Her body was impossibly thin, her skin pale as the snow, and her eyes, they were black voids, endless and unblinking. The figure tilted its head in a jerking, unnatural motion, its gaze fixed on Mia. Mia staggered back, her feet slipping on the icy ground. "Who are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond, but a grin stretched across its face, too wide, splitting its lips as if the act of smiling itself was unnatural. The voices grew deafening, all calling her name, and the figure started moving toward her, its steps silent and smooth, like it was gliding. Mia tried to run, but the snow felt like it was pulling her down, gripping her boots. Panic overtook her, her mind racing with a single thought. This thing wasn't human, and it wanted her. Mia stumbled back to her cabin, her heart still pounding in her chest, but the forest felt far too quiet now. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and as she shut the door behind her, she couldn't shake the image of the figure's empty, haunting eyes. She sank to the floor, gripping her head, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it real? Was she losing her mind? But then, from outside, came that faint whisper again, drifting through the cracks of the door. Her name, slow and deliberate. Mia froze, knowing deep down that the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. As Mia sat frozen, her hand trembling against the cold floor, a faint scratching sound began at the window. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with terror. Outside, she saw nothing. Yet, in the reflection of the glass, there was the figure, its eyes staring back at her. Slowly, it smiled. Mia's breath caught in her throat as a whisper grazed her ear. "You can never escape." The door creaked open behind her, but when she turned, there was no one. The terror had followed her inside, and she realized with horror that it would never let her go. You've just ventured through 3 terrifying tales, each more chilling than the last. But the darkness doesn't end here. Do you dare to face more? Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you're the first to hear the next horror story. Share this video with friends who think they can handle the fear. And remember, the real terror is only a click away.